am getting over. So I just want to name that in case I need to take a moment to mute and cough. But thank you so much to NSVRC for having me here today, asking for this presentation. First and foremost, I just needed to name that, like, I am not an expert in this area, and we have 10 minutes. And so I am here learning with you. These are just some of the things that I've learned along the way. So hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Ferrato, she, her, they, them pronouns. I'm the Sexual Violence Prevention and Public Health Initiatives Coordinator at the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence. The presentation was kind of named as Addressing Barriers to Violence, Sexual Violence Prevention. We're going to really hone in on critical race theory and its role in primary sexual violence prevention. I do want to name, as we kind of jump in, is that we are in the middle of Pride Month and we are approaching Juneteenth. There's federal recognition of these monumental pushes toward liberation, and yet we're also facing attempts by these very same systems to thwart liberation. And so when we're talking about these pieces of legislation and we're talking about these attempts to ban divisive topics, to ban trans athletes and gender affirming care, when we're talking about legislation that's going to overturn abortion rights, all of these things are intersecting, right? They're all interconnected. And so when we see these empty symbolic gestures of federally recognizing these moments, and they're being offered by the systems that are upholding power that can materially improve our lives, and they refuse to use it for that, it is violent. And so it's just incredibly important for us to name that symbolism without action is violent. And so when we see these pushes to suppress and oppress begin to happen in one or even a few states, it is time to prepare. It may not be happening in your state, but it doesn't mean that it can't happen, right? And so when we're proactively preparing to meet the moment, we're continuing to live in our visions of a world free from all violence. So today, while there will be a focus on responding to the conflation of critical race theory with primary prevention education, I encourage us to kind of widen our lenses so that we might adapt these tools in sustainable ways to repair the broken pieces and also to build more secure foundations beyond these systems that currently exist. Next slide, please. Oh, awesome. Okay, so I'm not going to read through each of these columns about what critical race theory is and what it is not. These slides are shared with folks in the Google Drive, so I encourage everyone to look over them. What I will name is that CRT can be a tool for primary prevention at a societal and institutional level, as it interrogates the biases and oppressive tactics used to perpetuate racist violence through a legislative and institutional lens. What it's not doing is being taught in primary prevention education. The framework of critical race theory can ensure that we do not look at racism as a past history, but rather as an active function and part of our society today. It can act as a framework to view how race as a social construct impacts our lives, including our education institutions that can uphold the violence of white supremacy through attempts to suppress information about the US's history of slavery, displacement, and genocide. We cannot separate violence prevention from racism because racism is a form of violence, and critical race theory helps at the institutional levels and at the legislative levels for us to better understand how it's actually trickling down into our education systems. Next slide, please. Full disclosure, I also totally forgot to hit my my stopwatch, so don't know where I'm at. All right. So why does this matter, right? It matters for a myriad of reasons, but we're going to kind of break it down into this ripple effect. Through state legislation, we're seeing many states plan or already in process of introducing legislation to ban divisive topics from K through 12 education, including critical race theory, which is spreading misinformation about what's even being shared in the classroom. This then affects local programs. Not only does it affect teachers who are in schools, it also affects folks who are coming into the schools, such as preventionists, to teach prevention education. We're already hearing from preventionists on the ground that that curricula is being surveilled, including kind of pushback on healthy relationship topics, as well as empathy building and power and privilege being integrated into lessons. This then really does trickle down and create a ripple effect of a potential increase in violence, because when we're not able to teach lessons in empathy and build those lifelong skills so that we are connecting with one another honestly and authentically, when we're not able to navigate conflict resolution, to grapple with privilege and oppression and how it shows up in our lives, this can create an increase in violence because it's increasing risk factors for both the perpetration and victimization of violence. But what we have to also kind of recognize is that we're often in this like moment of awestruck dismay, right? Every time this legislation is appearing. This is not unprecedented. These attacks on education have been happening for decades. We saw this back in the 1920s when there was legislation pushing to ensure that religion was at the center of education. You're seeing this in the 1930s when teachers were being surveilled to make sure that they weren't teaching indoctrination of communism to students. That continued on into the 50s, that continued on into the 60s. A quote that I'll just quickly share is that in the 1960s, California Superintendent of Public Instruction, Max Rafferty, called teachers bums who were focusing too much on America's faults instead of the quote unquote, the magnificent world-changing deeds of our national heroes. And so it just reminds us and kind of grounds us in the fact that this kind of pushback has been happening, and it can be felt on all socio-ecological levels, and we feel this over time. It is this constant kind of recycling of the same tactics to surveil and oppress and thwart our liberation. So we're seeing this right now, through the violence at school board meetings, increased classroom and curricula surveillance, threats to funding and licenses for both school districts and individual teachers. And we're also seeing a pushback or an exclusion of prevention education in the classroom. This does increase risk factors for our younger generations, because one of the protective factors is having caring adults in our spaces and trusted adults in our spaces. But when teachers are not allowed to tell the truth about our history, about our current events, when they're surveilled, there's going to be a fracture in the potential for that building of rapport and empathy with students. And this can also increase the likelihood of violence both within school systems and our communities. Next slide, please. So these all work together. It's really important, again, for us to see those intersections. So critical race theory is a part of an anti-oppressive approach to the systems and institutions that create policies and legislation. Critical race theory influences primary prevention legislation by identifying the intersections at which race and other oppressions are upheld through racist policies. It's not included in primary prevention education programming, but it can influence policies that expand primary prevention education, or it can be limited if we're not using critical race theory as a framework to propose different pieces of legislation. When we expand potential to teach lifelong lessons in empathy and equity through policies that support anti-oppressive education, including social emotional learning, which is featured here, we see primary violence prevention in action. These three foundations work concurrently and complementarily to build a world free from violence. So ultimately, the question is, so how do we ensure we're building those foundations so that we can meet the moment with confidence, strength, and understanding in the interconnectedness? Next slide, please. So we can ultimately look to these tools to navigate. Because I don't necessarily know where I'm at with time, what I will say is that we will go over more of these in depth within the breakout sessions. There's also an infographic that's been included on the Google Drive that does go more into depth on the tools to navigate, both for organizations and preventionists. It's really important that we recognize that we have an ability to meet the moment, both in like that kind of, I think about it with like disaster response, right? We have both the ability to mitigate by preparing different tactics ahead of time and strategies and tools ahead of time. And then we also have tools that can be integrated into responsiveness as well. So when we're working kind of in those two modes of short-term and long-term sustainability, we have an ability to kind of move out of that cycle of that awestruck and that dismay and move into action. So that's really what we'll be navigating within that breakout space, such as creating MOUs so that that can set a contractual agreement with community partners about what we are willing to do and what we are not willing to do in those spaces, what the curricula entails, what we expect of the community partners' role in the classroom or community space, and what we ask them not to do, and how we will not share necessarily our values and beliefs, but what we know based in data research and our community understanding of what is most effective to be teaching and learning with our students and with our young learners in those spaces together. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, we'll also go into more of that kind of individual frontline staff. How do we create sustainable tools, not only for staff to confidently go into spaces and be able to navigate potentially increased hostility or surveillance in those spaces, but how are we also internally supporting frontline staff who are doing this work day in and day out to ensure that we're minimizing harm as much as possible, and that we are setting a lot of boundaries, because that can be incredibly hard when we know that there's funding on the line and when we know that this is the right thing to be doing in the community to affect change. So again, this is where we're really going to start to imagine. I think that we really need to think about the fact that like we show up to work every day using our imaginations, because we are imagining a world free from violence as preventionists. And so we have to take that same imagination and start to apply it to the tools that we may already have in our toolbox, but how might we adapt those to be more flexible to meet each and every one of these moments, kind of head on, and also from a proactive standpoint. Next slide, please. So ultimately, just some references if you would like to look at any of those. And then on the last slide is my contact information, which I'll also drop in the chat. And we'll be talking a little bit more about those strategies. So I hope you'll join me in the breakout session if this is of interest to you. Thanks, y'all.